Hello, I'm Laura McCaughey, your host for this evening, and welcome to the final night of the final talk of Soapbox Science Sydney online. Over the last 3 nights, we've showcased 11 amazing Australian researchers, and we've got one more to share with you, the brilliant Julianna Kadar. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation upon whose ancestral lands UTS's City campus, from which we are streaming, now stands. I would also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. Soapbox Science Sydney is a platform for both promoting female researchers and the research that they do, and also for promoting an active and engaged dialogue between researchers and the public. This is a great opportunity to ask Julianna questions directly, so please do ask as many questions as you like. The more, the merrier. On this note, if you have any questions for Julianna during tonight's webinar, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. You can ask questions anonymously, and also if you like a question someone else has asked and would like it answered, then please use the upvoting tool, which is the wee thumbs up symbol next to the question itself. This session will also be recorded, but we will not be recording any video or audio input from the audience. If you have any concerns or questions over this, you can contact the Soapbox team via email at soapboxsciencesydney@gmail.com. As mentioned, our speaker tonight is the brilliant Julianna Kadar, a PhD student from the Fish Lab at Macquarie University. Julianna is originally from Southern California and has always loved the ocean, animals, and modern technology, and now she gets to combine all of these things in her research. Her research involves tagging and tracking Port Jackson sharks to find out about their behaviours and activity patterns. To do this, she uses tags that function like Fitbits, but for sharks, to see exactly what the sharks are up to while they can't be directly observed in the ocean. Her research will show how the ecosystems around us are functioning and what role sharks play in keeping the world's oceans healthy. Over to you, Julianna.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Laura. Happy to be here with everybody tonight. To get started, I thought it would be useful to talk about the PR, the image of sharks, before we actually start talking about them, because it actually has such a large effect on how people see them. And a lot of people are afraid of them. As we know, they're seen as bloodthirsty killing machines. And if after this session you go to Google and you type in shark, you can see what kind of search suggestions come up for you to see. And it'll be things like sharks attacking people, sharks killing people. And in my research and as shark scientists, we know that this image of them is really incorrect. They're actually unique animals that lead amazingly complex lives. And they're capable of having friends, so having social networks. They're capable of having personalities, so somewhere between the shy and bold axis, they can have personalities within that. And they can also learn and remember things. So they're really cognitively complex, and they can be really adaptable in so many ways. But despite all that, I know it is natural to fear them, but the problem arises when there's a lack of respect about the roles that they play in regulating ecosystems as apex predators. So they're just incredibly important to the functioning of our oceans. And it's not surprising that they're misunderstood, because there is so much that we don't know about them. And in my research, I'm contributing to better ways to study sharks. And my model species is actually the Port Jackson shark, or PJ shark, as we like to call it for short. And they're really common in Australia. They're found all over the place, and they actually aggregate in the tens of thousands. And this is why we wanted to study them, is because we think they're having really large effects on their surrounding ecosystems. And most often, you guys have probably seen them in places like Sydney Harbour, Jervis Bay, and Port Stephens, just resting on the ocean floor. Because, by the way, it's a myth that sharks have to swim to breathe. They can actually just pump water over their gills in this way. And for the last 6 years, we've been trying to answer questions about them. And one of the biggest mysteries about these sharks was that they were basically promptly appearing every year inside of the bays during wintertime to breed. And we knew that because, you could see hundreds of these eggs washing up on shore, and that was the remnants of that breeding time. But after that breeding season, they would just promptly disappear, and nobody really knew a lot about what they were up to inside of the bays, and also what they were getting up to once they left and where they were actually going. So with the fish lab at Macquarie University, we were tagging and tracking these sharks for the last 6 years by placing a small acoustic tag inside of the stomach cavity of the shark. And from this, we could see monthly and annual movements really clearly. And there was a lot of individual variation within the population that we could see. So a lot of the sharks were actually migrating north. Some of them were going off the continental shelf, and some of them were going south to these nutrient-rich waters near Tasmania. And so we were able to find out a lot about these rough scale movements, basically. But my work using these Fitbit style tags is going to try and delve a bit deeper. And I'm trying to find out what's happening on an hourly basis with these sharks and on a second to second basis to see what's going on with their feeding behavior. What are they eating? When are they the most active? And are there actually differences between male and female sharks? So those are the main questions I'm trying to answer at the moment. And I'll tell you more about those. But if you have any questions about that, then you can ask those now.
Thanks, Juliana. We've got the results to your poll that you asked. How do you feel about sharks? And it's a bit of a mixed bag, but at least half of the audience say that sharks are interesting, but I wouldn't want to meet one in real life. And that's probably where I lie, depending on the type of shark.
That makes a lot of sense. That, yeah, definitely that would be the outcome of that, because sharks are so diverse. There's so many different species. So of course, like you would, depending on who's out there in the ocean waiting for you, you'd hedge your bets based on that.
How many different types of sharks are there in Australia, and which one is the most common?
Overall, there are over 1,000 species of sharks and rays in Australia. So there's this huge amount of diversity. In Australia, the common sharks that you would think about as the typical sharks that are most often featured in media and in Shark Week as well are the tiger, the bull, and the white sharks. And of course, they're responsible for a lot of the bites. But actually, fun fact, the wobbegong is responsible for the most amount of bites on swimmers and whoever's in the water. So it wouldn't surprise me. I don't know the answer to that of what actually the most common species is in Australia, but it wouldn't surprise me if it is the Port Jackson shark, just because like tens of thousands of them are aggregating inside of our harbors and bays, basically in our very own backyard.
Do wobbegongs have teeth? Because one day when I was diving in Sydney, I seen a wobbegong and it must have been about 4 meters long. If that thing had teeth, I needed to swim faster.
Yes. So, but I mean, they're not gonna attack you in that way. Like all of the bites that happen are usually accidental, like a scuba or snorkeler accidentally leaning on one, and then the shark basically just defending itself. And that happens because they're so well camouflaged and things like that. But a lot of these benthic sharks have really interesting teeth. I actually have a picture here where they have these like crushing plates in the back that are really flat. And then in the front, they have these like smaller spiky teeth up there. So the crushing plates are for these benthic prey and things like that.
What kind of sharks might we encounter swimming around Sydney? So if we went diving around Sydney, what kind of sharks would we come across?
Oh my gosh. So definitely in the winter season, you get the Port Jackson shark. If you were a bit further up north in warmer waters, you could see epaulet sharks, which are absolutely gorgeous. Those are the walking sharks that come out onto the coral reefs and they can hunt prey that way. You can see a lot of sharks on the coral reef, but some of the rarer ones that you get down south that I was the most excited to see was the broad-nosed seven-gill shark. And those typically live in like deeper waters, but it just kind of came up to a spot in Jervis Bay and was swimming around and was a really incredible experience.
Oh, wow. There's some shark species that are protected because their populations are low. And should humans breed these sharks and return them to the wild to populate?
Oh, should they breed them and return them to the wild? That's a great question, actually. And so there's a lot of ethics involved with, breeding sharks or fish in captivity and then releasing them to the wild. And you have to think about things like survival rates. And in some species, that's really good. And in some, it's going to be pretty poor. But usually the types of things that we do to manage shark numbers are just to manage overfishing, because that's really the biggest threat, you know, where even if you're eating less seafood or something like that, that can help. But and unfortunately, like, you can't take gray nurse sharks anymore, of course, because they're really, really endangered, and that's a shame. But in a lot of these cases, like, overfishing is going to be the biggest problem.
So always look for seafood with the MSC tick.
Yes. Yeah, and there's an app called Good Fish as well that's really good in Australia.
Oh. Someone says, my favourite shark is a hammerhead. Will I ever see one diving in Sydney? And I can answer this one. I was on a whale watching boat a few years ago, just outside the harbour of Sydney, and we were standing looking for whales, and we seen a hammerhead shark swim underneath the boat. It was amazing.
That's incredible. Yeah, you could have jumped in the water right there and gone diving. So
no, stayed on the boat.
Stayed, okay.
Someone wants to know, do you think shark nets are a good idea, or are they just harmful?
So shark nets are really, really detrimental to so many different species, and there's no evidence at all that they're actually protecting swimmers. So I would say they are a bad idea. And there's like a May 2018 statistic that was really striking, and they caught like only a few, like 7 or 8 target species, so white bull sharks and tiger sharks, and the rest, like over 100 species, were all like turtles and dolphins, a bunch of rays, critically endangered gray nurse shark, and things like that, also hammerhead shark as well. So they're having big effects on the ecosystems, and they're not providing a lot of benefit. So it's better to use things like drones or other spotting apps to warn swimmers to get out of the water when you do see a shark. But of course, it's really interesting now that we have all these drones flying, and now we're just more aware that there are sharks around us and sharks near us. But actually, they were always there, and they just were never really that big of a problem, because, of course, it's really statistically rare that you would ever be attacked by a shark.
Yeah. Okay, I want to hear a bit more about your research and what information you get from this, from these tracking devices. So I'll hand back over to you.
I would ask you guys now to imagine a day in the life of a marine biologist. Imagine getting onto a boat and going out into the bay or the open ocean, and then just seeing meters of deep blue water below you, and then nothing but blue horizon in front of you. And then imagine having to study these sharks and actually track them and tag them. It gives you an idea of the difficulty of what we're faced with when we're trying to study these animals. And actually, sometimes we can't even find them. So that's usually the first hurdle. But this is why tags are amazing. They allow us to see what the animals are doing, even when we can't directly observe them. And they've really changed animal behavior science in a lot of ways. So what they do is they're measuring change in velocity over time. And so many scientists have applied them to many, many different animals. And right now you can actually tag something as small as a beetle or a jellyfish, or as big as a whale shark, and everything in between, actually. And what the Fitbit style tags are actually called are accelerometers. And they're basically just measuring when the shark goes up and down, back and forth, and side to side. And you can also see the posture of the animal as well. So if it's diving or something like that. And the tags that we use, they look like this, and they're just sealed in epoxy, so no water can get inside of it. But they are just souped up. They're a lot like your Fitbits or the sensors inside of your cell phone, but they're measuring at about 10 times per second. So they're giving us really, really detailed information about the important behaviors that are happening. And I have a small Port Jackson shark here, and I have my cell phone actually attached to it. So I can show you a bit about what's happening here. When the shark is resting, the line is really still and straight. But when the shark starts to swim, you can see peaks on that line. And when the shark chews on its prey or feeds, you can see that's different again. And that chewing behavior was actually what I was most interested interested in and what I wanted to find out most about. And this is actually how we collected the data to analyze with these sharks. We went out into Sydney Harbor, we collected a few sharks and brought them to Taronga Zoo. And then we attached the tags to those sharks and we actually filmed them while they were wearing the tags. And then after we did this and matched up those behaviors to the data in the tags, we went to Jervis Bay and we caught some wild sharks and we attached the tags to those. And then we left those on for about 10 days. And then we returned and searched for the tags. And that was actually the hardest part because it's basically like looking for a needle in a haystack. And what you have to do is you follow the pinging sound from the tag with this underwater listening device that's called a hydrophone. And eventually you find the shark and then we go down and we remove the tag and download the data that way. And the next challenging part is actually the data analysis. So I mentioned that these tags are recording at 10 times per second, and that ends up being millions of data points after about a week or 10 days. So I couldn't, and no one could actually classify that manually because it would just be impossible. So what animal behavior scientists are doing that are using these tags is we're using machine learning, which is a type of artificial intelligence, to have that automatically classify those behavior signatures. And what it is basically just the labeling of stuff using examples. And so machine learning does this automatically. And I mentioned that we already had those labeled behaviors from the zoo. So we knew that those were true and they were ground truthed. And all we had to do was apply those labels to the wild shark data when we couldn't actually observe the sharks while they were gone for 10 days. So we were really happy with the outcome of our final model with about a 92% accuracy. And we were able to safely say, like, yes, these sharks, we can see when they're chewing, when they're feeding, when they're resting and swimming and doing all these really dynamic, amazing behaviors. So I'll take it. Any questions on that?
Thanks, Juliana. That's really cool. So my Fitbit knows when I'm sleeping, when I'm running, when I'm just doing some light exercise. And your Fitbits on your sharks can see when they're eating, when they're swimming, when they're sleeping. It's really cool.
Yeah.
We do have a lot of questions. The first one is, how do the things surfers wear on their legs to keep sharks away work?
Oh, okay. So those are like, they're kind of like, if you've dived with those before, usually it's a little electric shock type of mechanism where it's like this long tail, like a meter or even 2 meters long. And then if something comes in contact with it, then it's going to give it like a light little shock. And if you touch those accidentally underwater, you know, it doesn't feel great, but it doesn't hurt that much either. And the reality is that there isn't that much evidence that those deter sharks either. So there's a lot of money going into shark deterrent research and figuring out what exactly will deter a shark, whether it's magnetic type of electrosensory things or whether it's bright lights, flashing lights. So they're doing those types of experiments now to see what works and what doesn't, what might actually attract them instead.
You don't want to be attracting the big ones. We've got a question. What sparked your interest to get into this line of work with sharks? And what is your favorite kind of shark and why?
Oh, so I think I was sparked just first by the technology. I thought this technology was absolutely incredible because it's kind of like you're seeing this whole secret life and this secret world, and we're basically like detectives, you know, spying on the animals. And then of course I know that sharks have this really bad image that is like pretty much completely undeserved. And to be able to change the public perception of these animals made me like really inspired and just like happy to commit most all of my time to this as I'm doing now. So yeah.
And then, what's your favorite kind of shark?
Yeah, that one is easy for me. I'm so biased. I spend so much time with Port Jackson sharks and I've just gotten to know them so well. They really do have different personalities. They move differently. I can tell when they're, you know, a little bit maybe stressed or upset because they like put their pectoral fins down and get a little bit bigger. And yeah, when you spend so much time with these animals, you can't help but completely fall in love with them. So.
Oh, that's nice. Some people want to know how you actually put the tag on the shark and where do you put it?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways that we do that. One of them is a direct attachment to the dorsal fin. So we just put it on there, kind of like an ear piercing, because they are cartilaginous. And then the second way is to use a harness, kind of like a shark wetsuit. And I've used a couple different methods for that too, but one of them was an adapted dog harness. So picture a little dog harness, and then I had to learn how to sew and then adapt that and make sure it was really comfortable and freely moving for the shark. And that's the second way we used.
I always think when you see little dogs walking down the street wearing jumpers and stuff that they look pretty silly. I can't imagine how silly a Port Jackson looks in its little harness.
I should show you. They're pretty funny pictures. Yeah.
What happens if you can't find the tags again? Can you still use, do you still get the data remotely, or is that data lost?
It is lost. So unfortunately, these tags, because there's so much data on them, they can't transmit it to an underwater receiver. And these sharks don't surface, so we can't use satellite tags or anything like that. Those would be too expensive anyway. But these you actually have to find again, and you have to just download on your computer. So we have had a couple of cases where we did lose a tag, and then luckily someone found it like 4 hours south on some remote beach, which was really lucky. And of course, on the back of the tags, it's our phone number and email and reward as well as written on there. So it's handy when people do find them.
Oh, excellent. It's like a dog collar then.
Yes, without the dog.
Without the dog. How often do Port Jackson sharks eat, and what do they eat?
That's a great question. I'm going to talk more about that too. But they're basically they were thought to prey on sand, things that live in the sand. So bivalves like snails, mollusks, clams, urchins, and we didn't really know if they were preying on higher trophic level prey like fish, but it turns out that the males are. And so they have these mouths and those crushing plates that I showed you earlier. So they're perfectly adapted to eat those harder prey items and then flush out the shells and those things like out of their gills.
Hmm. Is it the Port Jackson sharks that are the brown spirals? Port Jackson shark eggs that are the brown spirals?
Yes, that's right. And they look just like seaweed and they feel like it too. And that corkscrew shape, that spiral shape, allows them to get wedged into rock crevices.
Oh.
It was previously thought and written about that the sharks are the ones putting them into rock crevices, but that's not true. They're actually just floating around in the water, and they're developing in the water for 10 to 12 months before they hatch. So they eventually get pushed into rock crevices and develop inside of there.
So when they baby sharks hatch, they're just on their own? They don't have a mummy or a daddy to help them?
That's right. Yep, totally on their own. They
Scary.
do have a couple of really sharp like spines on their back. So those are helpful for them.
Okay, well, in terms of time, I want to hear a wee bit more about your research, and then we'll wrap up with a Q&A at the end.
So I can tell you guys a bit more about what we actually found now. So I mentioned earlier that these sharks are most often seen resting on the ocean floor, and maybe people thought they were a bit lazy because of this, because they were just, down there all day. But it turns out, and we could see from this tag data, that they're actually nocturnal. So they rise in activity after the sun sets, and they're peaking around midnight and then decreasing in activity before the sun rises. And many of you must know too that other sharks are crepuscular, so they rise in activity when the sun rises and then when it sets again. But PJs are actually displaying this really strong nocturnal pattern. And then even more interestingly, when we zoomed in on this fine scale data and we looked at the seconds and things like that, we could see there were differences between the males and females. So both of these sexes were feeding during the breeding season. They were feeding frequently, but the males were actually feeding more frequently than the females, and they were feeding more often compared to resting and all these things. So they were having large effects on the ecosystem based on what they're eating. And from other analysis, we also knew that the males were, like I mentioned, feeding on the higher trophic level prey, like small fish, and then females were feeding more on the lower level prey, like urchins. But there's still a lot of crossover there in between. So they're eating basically, small fish and urchins and bivalves and mollusks. So it was exciting to see some sex differences here, but also exciting to confirm that they're having these effects on the ecosystems right in our backyards. And suddenly with all of these things we found out through the fish lab, we had this new clearer picture of what was happening. The males were actually arriving first annually, and we think this was because they were trying to stake out their territories to get ready for the females, because the females arrived about a month later, and they stayed really low in their activity levels. And we think this was because they were trying to avoid mating attempts and harassment from the males. And then while the females were in there during breeding season, they were laying 2 eggs every 2 weeks over 4 months, so 16 eggs per shark. And then the females were actually staying later than the males. The males were departing first. And we thought this was because the females are trying to reduce egg mortality, because the sharks will actually predate on their own eggs. So if the females stay later, then it's more likely that that juvenile shark will actually survive. And all of this means basically that they're just functioning as really important nutrient belts from the south to the north. So from these nutrient-rich waters in the south, they're carrying things up to places like Sydney Harbor and Jervis Bay and Port Stevens. And they're laying thousands of these eggs, which are an important food source for hundreds of species that are all around us. And importantly, they're actually eating a lot of urchins, and the urchins are the ones that feed on kelp. And so this means that they're important regulators of our entire southern reef, which is basically made up of giant kelp forests, and fish depend on them for their homes. And if you think about other ecosystems where things like this are happening, it's really easy to picture the big cats in Africa, for example, where the big cats are regulating the grazers like gazelles and antelopes. And because they're feeding on those, they're keeping the whole grasslands balanced and in check. Because if there were no big cats, then the grazers would take over, and then the ecosystem would collapse. And this is exactly what's happening inside of our oceans, but it's just a bit harder to see there. And all of this has called our attention to the fact that these are really sensitive systems, and it's important to understand the functions that these animals are playing inside of these systems, especially when we have big challenges ahead, like climate change and like ocean acidity. It's important to think about how things will change and what we can look for to try and stop these changes. And the tags can really help with this as well, because aside from just having movement sensors in them, they can actually have other sensors in them, like temperature and also like pH for acidity, also depth, and also a magnetometer for the magnetic field of the Earth. So there's really big potential here to find out about which environmental factors are influencing the movements and the distributions of these animals too.
Thanks, Julianna. That was really interesting. It's always good when you get to hear that you're getting positive results from your studies, and you're actually finding out some new stuff about these sharks. Yeah. You mentioned there kind of the circle of life with the big cats in Africa. Are the Port Jackson sharks preyed on by other animals?
So not that we know of, that they actually don't seem to be preyed on by other animals. We have seen the juveniles kind of chased, but when we did a BRUV study, which is a baited remote underwater video study, the baby sharks, the juvenile sharks, were actually not preyed upon. And so by the time they're older, like the ones that we study, they are just resting on the ground, and it makes them really easy to work with because they're not afraid of you, and you can catch them and work with them so easily.
Well, that's good to know that they're not eaten by other sharks.
Yeah.
What other shark species do your lab work on, or is it just the Port Jackson?
So we actually work on, I've done a couple observational studies on the leopard sharks, as well as some epaulet sharks as well. Those are commonly kept in aquariums, and it's really convenient and nice to do work inside of aquariums because you just have a 100% kind of visual just access to the species that you're studying, which is so nice because we never get that inside of the ocean. And that's that one. And then basically we're doing some cage diving study, our collaborators, on the white sharks and how cage diving is affecting some of those movements of the larger sharks as well. So yeah, there's lots of interesting work going on at the moment.
Do you think the behaviour of the sharks in the aquariums differs to that in the ocean? So you can use the aquarium sharks to train your models, but do you think it's a true reflection of how they behave?
It's a great question that you asked that, because of course we're not allowed to feed the aquarium sharks any live animals, and that's part of what they're eating in the wild. So we're actually just feeding them dead squid inside of the aquariums, and that's what we're training our model on as well. So we can see that the model has some bias in it already, which is why I tried to focus in on this chewing behavior to get that to be the indicator of a successful feeding attempt. But there are some potential differences there. And we have seen the aquarium sharks acting a bit different from time to time. So we did a study where we had the sharks tagged in the aquarium, and at the same time we were monitoring sharks inside of Sydney Harbor and Jervis Bay. And when the wild sharks actually left and started migrating, the sharks in captivity elevated their activity levels, and they started swimming more actively during that time. And it was really interesting to see that that was actually the same. It was reflected to their wild counterparts. And it was a phenomenon that's mostly seen in birds, actually. This migratory restlessness is what it's called. And it was so exciting to see that in the captive sharks. Were witnessing this type of knowledge or trigger that it's migration time, gotta go, you know.
So it's like a built-in function into the sharks.
Mm.
The reason I asked about the behaviour differences is because they've tried several times to keep great whites in captivity, but they've never succeeded yet. The sharks always die. Any idea why that is? Why you can keep some species but others just will not live in captivity?
It is such like a mystery. And I think that the aquarists and the people who do this professionally are always refining their practices and trying to get better and better at it. And Monterey Aquarium in California has been successful at keeping a white shark for like extended periods of time and then letting it go. And then it just blows my mind too that you can keep a whale shark in an aquarium, and that shark seems to be okay and functioning, and that's fine. But yeah, certain sharks you just can't keep in captivity, and it's still a mystery as to why.
Someone wants to know why there are a lot of Port Jackson sharks around Shelley Beach at the moment, which is just next to Manly.
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty much breeding season right now. So if you jump in the water, you'll see both males and females, and they'll be there until about the first week of October, probably. And then the females will be there closer to November. And they're beautiful. Yeah, you just jump in, you see them there. And Shelley is actually a marine protected area. So maybe they like hanging out there for some reason.
As much as I would like to go back
But
and see
it's
them, I'm a fair weather diver, so I think I might give it a miss.
Yes, yeah, that's so true that it is nice diving in a really thin wetsuit and in warm water. That's true. Unfortunately, when we go to Jervis Bay, it's very, very cold, and I'm wearing the thickest wetsuit possible. So, you know, but it's so worth it, because when you get down there, you just see like this whole kelp forest, and you see the sharks piled on top of one another in this like natural state, and it's really beautiful.
We've got a question here that touches on something you mentioned earlier about the Port Jackson shark eggs. Someone said, according to some sources, females wedge the eggs between rocks with their mouth, which you mentioned that isn't true. But according to others, they just swim away after they lay their eggs. What one is correct, and what is the behaviour?
Yeah, so we've witnessed it over and over again, mostly in captivity, and very sparingly in the wild, because you know you can only be in there for a short amount of time seeing these things. But and my colleagues and I've witnessed the shark laying an egg, and the shark basically just swims away. I've seen the shark actually do a little wiggle when it's laid an egg before, to try and like get the egg out potentially. So that happens, but sometimes the egg just falls out, and the shark goes on its way. And yeah, they're definitely not putting them into rock crevices because they're predating upon their own eggs and they're eating them. And at the zoo, I had 10 sharks inside of the tank, and basically a shark would lay an egg, and if I didn't jump in within an hour, then that egg would be eaten and gone in that time frame. So I had to be really quick to get those eggs out.
Wow. What's the furthest you've ever seen a Port Jackson swim? How far away do they go?
Well, I think so. The longest migration that we've seen is the one from Sydney Harbor or Jervis Bay all the way down to Bass Strait, basically. And it's like 1,000 kilometers, and the shark's only meter and a half long. So, this is a bullhead shark as well. So this isn't really common and typical behavior for a shark like this to be aggregating in such huge numbers and then migrating and coming back every year. And the most amazing thing too is that they have really high site fidelity, which basically means that 100% of males that we tagged were coming back to the very same reef each year to breed. So they're doing this trip annually and they're coming back to the exact same location. So not only are they capable of these really long distance migrations, but they have amazing navigation abilities as well.
I saw an article saying that sharks are now functionally extinct. What does that mean?
Yes, that came out recently, and there's basically saying that 18% of sharks in these coral reefs are no longer there, and these populations are really, really degraded. And unfortunately, that the main factor there is overfishing. And so when an animal is functionally extinct, it just means that there aren't enough of them around to be fulfilling the ecosystem functions that they need to be doing to maintain that balance in those locations. So unfortunately, a lot of shark populations are in trouble, and studies like that are really important because, again, we just can't see a lot of what's happening in the ocean, and we have to take the time to assess those numbers and those populations to make sure that we keep them healthy.
That's really sad because what did you say, 18%? That's quite high.
Yes.
So what can we do to help sharks?
So I mean, even what you're doing now, like just listening to this, learning more about them, learning as much as you can, sharing it with your friends. And of course, the apps that we talked about earlier, so the Good Fish app, and even just avoiding seafood sometimes is a good start. And also getting your hands dirty if you're up for it, like donating or volunteering at any of these ocean conservation organizations is a great way to give back. And that can be anything from working with animals or just like trying to get plastic off of our beaches and helping animals that way too.
Oh, excellent. I did help out with a Port Jackson dive once where we had to count the number of Port Jacksons that we've seen. So that was really cool.
That's very cool. Yeah, citizen science is also really important. So that's a great way to give back and do some science while you're out there. Yeah.
I've got time for one last question, and that is, what made you get into science and what is it you love about the work that you do?
Yes. So I started out just loving animals, naturally, and it was really easy for me just to sit and stare at them, and that's been a part of my life since the very beginning. I think I was in math class in like, sixth grade, and I was looking out the window at a group of bunnies, and it was totally mesmerizing for me. And any chance I got to stand in front of an aquarium, I would take it and try to assess, the social networks and like relationships that were going on. And I didn't know that animal behavior was actually a career until I got to university. So I was studying to be a veterinarian, and I figured that was my path, and I found out that this is a potential avenue, and I couldn't think of anything better, staring at animals all day and being in the ocean and seeing these ecosystems around us. And then I've also really had an affinity for technology. So this is just like pretty incredible that we can see what the animals are doing and figure out what's going on behind them. And then, nobody knows like what these animals are thinking, what they're doing, what they're actually up to. So being able to find that out and having the potential to use science to change the public perception of these animals is really the best part. So yeah, sharks are villainized and they're seen as bloodthirsty killing machines by a lot of people. And then if we can use science to set the record straight and to show that, you know, they lead these amazingly complex lives, then that's a great thing to do, I think.
It really does sound like you're doing your dream job.
I guess it is, yeah.
Well, that's nice to hear. Thank you for a really interesting talk tonight, Julianna. Sharks are something that you either love them or you hate them, but everyone wants to know something about them. So thank you very much for tonight. And thank you to everyone who attended and asked questions tonight. We couldn't run Soapbox Science Sydney without our very generous sponsors, the University of Technology Sydney, Equus, Exciton, and the University of Wollongong. So we would like to thank them for the continued support. From myself and the Soapbox Science Sydney organising team, and for all of the speakers that we've had over the last 4 nights, I would like to thank all the attendees of our events for a very enjoyable and memorable National Science Week 2020. Stay safe and good night.